In May of 1971, I went to work in Mr. Marchiondo's office for him, and I have been there ever since, never knowing what an incredible experience it was going to be.
I met William C. just around the courthouse in way back when, and I would take every opportunity to go into a courtroom where Billy was arguing or trying a case, because he was just the best that ever was in those days, and so that's how we got to know each other, just around the courthouse.
I met Mr. Marchiondo in the early 80s here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Actually, I did work for him without knowing him. He was a party to a lawsuit, and a writ of prohibition was pending in the Supreme Court on his behalf, an alternative writ, and I was hired to write the brief on the merits, never having met him before. And I basically lived in the library here for weeks at a time, wrote the brief, went and argued it, and won it without knowing who he was. And then after that is how I got to meet him.
He was always a man of his word. If he told you something, you could rely on it totally. That was his bond. He also had such strong family ties that became very evident very early on. I had only been there about 4 months, and one of his clients arranged for his mother to have an audience with the Pope in Italy, and he and 2 of his brothers took their mother to Italy, and he has a marvelous picture of his mother and his brothers with the Pope at that time.
He had a charm that came across to a jury, and you could see him either in cross-examination or an argument to a jury, even if what he was cross-examining about was totally irrelevant. The jury just sat there and smiled and nodded in agreement with him and were totally convinced by him, even though they didn't even know what they were convinced of.
My favorite thing about Mr. Marchiondo is his love of life and the way he deals with people and associates with them. He just absolutely loves every minute of every day.
He never made a difference between the wealthy clients and well-known clients and those people who he just met from all walks of life, who he almost became friends with everybody he ever met in one way or the other. And they all got the same attention from him. He did his very best for all of them. So that really impressed me.
New Mexico's a young state, and we don't have much case law. And back when Billy first started practicing, we had even less. And so he has really been responsible for quite advanced thinking on many issues, certainly in the criminal law.
Mr. Marchiondo has made this a better legal community from the very beginning as a young lawyer. When he became a lawyer, all the lawyers in town had to represent indigents in court. And it was federal court and state court. And as a consequence, it didn't matter what your practice was. There were a lot of guilty pleas. And they'd have arraignment day, and the federal judge would be sitting up there, and he'd hear, how do you plead guilty? How do you plead guilty? How do you plead guilty? And one day he heard the words not guilty. And just to make sure he heard it right, the judge looked up and he looked down and saw a young lawyer standing before him, and he says, "Did I hear you right?" He says, "Yes. This man has a defense to this case, and he wants a trial." And from that day forward, he was known. He would represent these clients, and not only would he represent them with vigor, but then he started getting not guilty verdicts in seemingly impossible cases. The press took notice of that, and it took off from there.
I would describe him as a trial lawyer the way I just heard another lawyer a couple of weeks ago say. He said that when he and some of the other lawyers who were around his age, which is considerably younger than Mr. Marchiondo, they would go to the courthouse specifically to watch him in trial, and his words were so that they could learn how to do it the right way.
Well, I think he's influenced me the same he has many other lawyers. In other words, the one thing about Billy is that if you were his client, first of all, it was difficult to become his client, but once you became his client, he was absolutely 100% in your defense, or in that client's defense, and would move heaven and earth to defend a client, to acquit a client, or to get him the best possible disposition. There was really nothing within the bounds of the law that Billy would not do for a client. His loyalty and his doggedness and his persistence are just unmatched. And so time and time again, I've seen him take a difficult case. Sometimes I've worked with him on those cases, and push it to the extent that eventually the client is acquitted or otherwise exonerated in a case that when it began, no one thought it had any hope whatsoever.
Not only since he from the beginning altered the legal landscape of New Mexico throughout his total legal career spanning over 60 years, he's actually created law. We have law in New Mexico on grand juries that other states are envious of because of his efforts. The case of Davis versus Traub, which he created from the ground up, holds that a non-authorized person before a grand jury invalidates that indictment, regardless of whether there's prejudice. And he's kept that up throughout the years, and most recently, every indictment pending in the state of New Mexico was held to be invalid by virtue of the failure of the district attorney to instruct the grand juries on the essential elements of the crime on the record. That case first went to the New Mexico Court of Appeals, and then it went to the New Mexico Supreme Court. The district attorney, the state was arguing in that case, but this will invalidate all of these indictments. And Justice Franchini was heard to comment at that time, "I don't care, this is wrong." And that, I know he's very, very proud of that law.
Mr. Marchiondo and I are great friends. I've worked for him for almost 44 years. I know all of his family. He knows my family. He has 4 generations of his family now who rely on him as the patriarch of the family, even though he is the youngest of the 10 children.
He's a friend, and I would consider him to be generous to a fault. It's very difficult to pick up a tab around Billy, although I've done it a few times. He would never admit that, but I have. And he's a friend, and he's encouraging of other lawyers in their cases. I remember one time I won a big case, and the jury came, it was a high-profile case, and the jury came in late on a Friday. And I went back to the office very late on a Friday night. Nobody was around, and Billy called, and he had heard about the acquittal. And he said, "Congratulations." He said, "I just wanted to tell you one thing, though." And I said, "What's that, Billy?" And he said, "When you're looking in the mirror and you're saying to yourself, 'Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the goodest of them all?' He said, just look up over your shoulder and you'll see that fat little Italian looking back at you, because you're not that good yet."
I consider Mr. Marchiondo to be a friend of mine because he's been a mentor to me since I came to meet him 30-some years ago. He made me what I am today. I'm really pleased to be asked to speak about Billy tonight. Billy, does this mean I don't owe you that money anymore?